Hello, my name is Ted Turno, and you have, by chance or providence, stumbled upon another one of my YouTube PowerPoint lectures that I assign to students so that I can save a little time in class. This one I would have given in class in my Understanding Media Fandom class, but I'm in the middle of writing a book on this very topic, and so I wanted to present my own research to my class, but still give them an idea of the arguments and the debate that happens in fan studies around this topic. So it's going to be longish, so sit back, relax, get yourself some popcorn or coffee or whatever, and we shall begin. And if you're not in my class, you're welcome. You're always welcome. And I hope you learned something. So, on the face of it, there seems to be a lot in common between fandom and religion. Fans often use the language of worship and conversion to describe their attraction to and entrance into their chosen fandom. I just adore Michael Jackson. I was just so swept away. I fell in love with that television series. It hooked me in. Tom Waits is God. I actually read that on a YouTube comment thread. Sometimes they speak with their bodies, bowing down before their fan object of worship. They reach to touch, make contact with celebrities. They surround stars to get an autograph. It is a behavior that is anything but cool and detached. Fans invest themselves and their self-image and a lot more, like money and emotional life, into their fandom. They see themselves in their fan object. They see in their fan object a home, even a life philosophy or a worldview. This is what fan scholar Cornel Sandvoss calls convergence, where fan life and fan object kind of merge. Fans are often super focused on the object of their fandom, exploring it with every bit of care and passion that a religious believer would give to a sacred text. The picture on the left is of a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan-led panel from DragonCon 2011. It wasn't the one I was at. I was there in 2013 and 2015, but that's the picture I could find on the interwebs. So, why not just say fandom is religion and be done with it? Because not everyone sees it that way. There is a debate going on within fan studies, and has been for decades, between those who see fandom as a religious phenomenon and those who absolutely do not. And we're going to explore this debate. Is religion a good metaphor or model for understanding fandom? And I'm going to be drawing the arguments against mostly from two sources. Henry Jenkins, who's a very famous, well-established fan scholar, his 2006 books, Fan, Bloggers, and Gamers, Exploring Participatory Culture, which is essays and interviews and so on, and Cornel Sandvoss's 2005 book, Fans, the Mirror of Consumption. And yes, there are more recent arguments that have been proposed since 2005, 2006, but they are often very technical, and I've not seen the arguments that these guys put forward really considered much, much less refuted. I have seen it some in in a book called Fandom as Religion by a female media marketing scholar named Bickerdike, but not much anywhere else. And that book didn't really get wide distribution. Anyway, so is fandom a religion? And we're going to look at the arguments against. The first argument against comes from both Cornel Sandvoss and Henry Jenkins. For Sandvoss, pages 62 and 63, and Jenkins, pages 18 and 19. They argue that because fandom does not demand exclusive loyalty, that therefore it is not truly religion. For Sandvoss, people can be Christians and Elvis fans. For Jenkins, you can be a fan of Star Trek and a fan of Star Wars. That is, you can belong to multiple fandoms, and that means obviously that these are not religiously exclusive. They're not exclusive belief systems, or they're not like religion, because religion's exclusive. It is obvious to me that Jenkins knows very little about religion or religious studies. If he did, he would know that there are a whole slew of non-exclusive religions in the world, major world religions like Hinduism since the 19th century has had in it a doctrine of non-exclusivity. This guy is Swami Vivekananda, and he said this: "I am proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true." This is true for Hinduism, at least in theory. It doesn't often work out in practice like that. There is still a lot of religious violence in India perpetrated against Muslims and Christians, especially since the BJP came to power and Narendra Modi. This has not been a tolerant time in India of late. But in theory, it is possible to worship Krishna and Christ, Shiva and Buddha. If you are a well-educated Hindu, you probably believe that this non-exclusive belief system is what makes your religion superior. It is even more sophisticated to be religiously relativistic. Hare Krishnas will argue with you, as one did argue with me many years ago, that when you worship Christ, you are really worshiping Krishna, since Krishna is the ultimate but non-exclusive form of God. And many religions in the West have likewise become relativistic and non-exclusive. New Age religion sees itself often as a series of spiritual techniques that can be kind of tacked on to any religion. Christ plus crystals, plus a dash of Jewish Kabbalistic mysticism, plus meditation. But there is no doubt that these are in fact religious practices. They like to call them spiritual, but not religious. But they are religious ritualistic practices. Sandvoss sees Christian Elvis fans as evidence that fandom is not religious. How could you call fandom religious if you have religious fans, right? They can't be bi-religious. This may or may not be relevant. Christianity certainly does demand exclusive loyalty, as Jesus makes very clear many times in the Gospels. But Sandvoss never seems to consider that there are culturally compromised versions of Christianity, that Christians can indeed entertain competing loyalties that undermine their faith without them even being aware of it. Loyalties to, for instance, nation, or to a political agenda, or to a career and earning money. You know, Jesus said in Matthew 6, you cannot serve both God and money. Would it make sense for Jesus to say, you cannot serve both God and Elvis? Now, if that makes sense, and I think it does, if there can be competing loyalties that undermine traditional religious devotion, then shouldn't we admit that fandoms can indeed have a religious impact? Couldn't fandom serve as a religious competition to traditional Christianity, that hardcore fans that elevate Elvis to a near deity status, like that's a real t-shirt over there on the right, to a near deity status, are in danger of, in fact, compromising their Christian faith? Sandvoss's argument against fandom as religion seems, therefore, much weaker. And furthermore, and something curiously ignored by Jenkins in that optional reading that I gave you guys, some fandoms can be very exclusive, especially when it comes to sports fandoms. One cannot be both a Chelsea supporter and a Manchester United fan. Where I grew up, you could not be both a Pittsburgh Steelers and a Dallas Cowboys fan. Not in central Pennsylvania in the 1970s. It simply cannot be done. And if you live in Philadelphia, you cannot be a Philadelphia Eagles and a Dallas Cowboys fan. It just isn't done. These are exclusive loyalties. And in some quarters, you cannot be both a Star Trek and a Star Wars fan. When Dragon Con arranges their things, they keep the Star Trek fans away from the Star Wars fans for this specific reason. Or you cannot be both a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan and a Twilight fan. At least not in my house. Why? Because vampires don't sparkle. That's why. There are, that is to say, definite rivalries and loyalties that those who say, well, fandom isn't exclusive, simply overlook. There are some fandoms that are kind of really exclusive. Let me give you an example. This guy is a journalist, and he wrote this for The Guardian. His name is Sarfraz Manzoor. He lives in the UK. Obviously, he is from Pakistani Muslim background. He actually wrote a movie about his experiences growing up and becoming a Bruce Springsteen fan called Blinded by the Light. It's a decent movie. I mean, kind of Hollywood, even though it's British. Anyway, he wrote this. The question, when does fandom become religion? I was raised in a Muslim household, fasting during the month of Ramadan, celebrating Eid by visiting the mosque, and of course, abstaining from the sins of alcohol and pork. Religion, in my case, Islam, provided ready answers to all the big questions of how to live and act, and it bound my family and I up with fellow Muslims. Religion also offered an identity. I knew what I was. I was a Muslim. It was during my teenage years that I began to challenge the notion of a religious identity, and I do not think it is a coincidence that it was while I was in the process of losing my religion that I found rock and roll. I became a music fan and found in fandom many of the things that others found in religion. Interesting. The parallels between music and religion are striking. Of course, there are the charismatic frontmen with messiah complexes who enjoy preaching to huge crowds at large gatherings of the faithful. There's also a communal sense of devotion at concerts, the knowledge that one is around fellow believers. This certainly has echoes of religion. When I began to attend Bruce Springsteen concerts, that was one of the most gratifying aspects to my emerging identity as a fan. In everyday life, I felt like a rarity, but at concerts, I was surrounded by countless others who also understood the appeal of the great man. One of the things that is most appealing about fandom in music or football or literature is that entry to the community is more easily secured than in religion. Enthusiasm is enough. You just need to buy a ticket. In fandom, as in faith, hostility between believers can be acute. The hatred that exists between local football teams is akin to the schisms between religious sects. As a Bruce Springsteen fan, I do not believe my own fanaticism is in any way strange. Hardcore fans of, say, Michael Jackson, and this was written when Jackson was still alive, Michael Jackson are, by contrast, oddballs and freaks who need to get a life. For all the similarities between fandom and religion, one critical difference is that fandom rarely includes a moral dimension. It can, and I'll question that a little bit later. I don't think it's that rare, actually. It can amount to an obsession, but even the most ardent fan of Manchester United or Pete Doherty, is unlikely to argue that their heroes provide a complete moral framework of how to live. For the faithful, religion explains the purpose of life, and it gives a reason to live. It places the smallness of our individual lives in a larger spiritual perspective. That is why, although I am not especially religious, I can still understand its appeal. Most fandom is ultimately superficial, though enjoyable. For the big answers to the big questions, it is perhaps better to have faith in religion or reason than in rock and roll. Now, please note what Manzoor is saying. Not that fandoms aren't religious, but that they don't provide good moral guidance. And so they make kind of bad religions when compared to traditional religions or faith in reason, which is a more modern type of religion, I would argue. That may be changing, though, with the politicization of fandoms that require fans to have a certain ethic. That is, some fandoms demand a certain sort of ethic or political perspective. It gets kind of gatekeepy. But the main point is that fan scholars are simply wrong about fandom and exclusivity. Some fandoms really aren't exclusive, but some really are. So overall, the fact that some fandoms are exclusive says very little about whether fandom in general is or is not a functional religion. What it does say is that those particular fandoms that are non-exclusive do not resemble exclusivist religions, especially the classic religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But it does nothing about the exclusive fandoms, nor does it say anything about whether fandom might be fruitfully thought of as a non-exclusive type of religion like Vivekananda's Hinduism. Exclusivity per se is not a defining feature of religion. All right, so that's the first. That is the first argument. Second argument: fandom, unlike religion, is volunteerist and non-universal. So closely related to the idea that fandom cannot be usefully considered through the metaphorical lens of religion because fandom is volunteerist. That is, it's something you choose. It's private. It's subjective. Sandvoss, this is Cornel Sandvoss's take on Roger Aiden's concept of multiple promised lands. And Sandvoss talks about this on page 63 of Fan's Mirror of Consumption. And Roger Aiden wrote this book about called Popular Stories and Promised Lands, Fan Cultures and Symbolic Pilgrimages back in 1999. And he talks about how fandom is replacing religion, but in a way that's non-exclusive, so that instead of one promised land, we can have multiple promised lands. Religion, by contrast, Jenkins and Sandvoss argue, demands to be taken as a total tradition, whereas fandom is variable and differs from fan to fan. Again, I find that there is a lack of comprehension about how very flexible the category of religion really is. One of the hallmarks of 20th and 21st century religion has been the degree to which religious practice has become privatized, both within and outside of religious institutions. Many people in Western Europe still believe, but they don't attend or join churches, except for those special occasions like birth, baptisms, weddings, and burials. Sociologist Grace Davy calls this believing without belonging. And she says that's what characterized much of post-World War II religion in Britain. Again, New Age religion, or the way people now feel entitled to pick and choose things from various religion and combine them into a kind of a private belief smorgasbord system, shows the degree to which religion has become privatized, an artifact of consumerism where the customer is always right and you can do whatever you want. This is what sociologist Robert Bellah and his collaborators famously symbolized as Sheilaism in his landmark study of the privatization of American religion in the 1980s called Habits of the Heart. He says, as an example of this widespread phenomenon, he described a nurse, Sheila Larson, who, quote, has actually named her religion, what she calls it her faith, after herself, close quote. In other words, quote, I believe in God. I'm not a religious fanatic. I can't remember the last time I went to church. My faith has carried me a long way. It's Sheilaism, just my own little voice, close quote. She defined my own Sheilaism in the following way, quote, it's just try to love yourself and be gentle with yourself. I guess take care of each other. I think he, that is God, would want us to take care of each other. So my argument here is that if some forms of religion have become essentially private reserves of emotional sentiment and ethical opinion, why can't fandom be considered as a type of privatized religion, or what British sociologist Edward Bailey called implicit religion, the way even non-significant religious goods can be supercharged with a kind of ultimate significance. Third argument, fandom imitates and competes with sacred persons in a way that religions would never. Sandvoss, I find even less convincing in his use of a fan scholar named Nightingale and Nightingale's understanding of Elvis impersonators, and he discusses this on page 62 of Fan's Mirror of Consumption. He says that the impersonators relate to Elvis in a way unlike religious devotion. They try to mimic Elvis, and so, according to Sandvoss, they try to supplant Elvis in a way that they would never, ever try to supplant God. In other words, being an Elvis impersonator, you're actually trying to become Elvis and therefore unseat Elvis somehow. However, this misreads both Elvis impersonators and religion. Let's talk about religion. On the one hand, there are plenty of examples in world religions where believers imitate their God without supplanting him or her or it. For example, in Bali, there are animist Buddhist sects that perform dramas where the players become spirit-possessed by the deities and demons they are portraying. In this case, on the left, the shaggy comic kind of bear dog thing called Barong, and the terrifying demon witch on the right, Rangda. If you want to know more about it, and it's fascinating, read the essay about it in Clifford Geertz's 1973 book of essays called Interpretation of Cultures. But the point is, no one, either in the play or in the audience, would assume that the gods or demons are being supplanted. If anything, they're being honored. Or likewise, Krishna followers try to attain Krishna consciousness. They actually say when they are chanting Krishna is dancing on your tongue, they want to become like Lord Krishna, but they are therefore not attempting to supplant Krishna. Like, for crying out loud, Christians are called in the Bible to imitate Christ in their everyday lives. And evangelicals have popularized this with the little WWJD, what would Jesus do bracelets. In the past, like in the Middle Ages, Christian performers would portray Christ, would mimic Christ on stage in what were called passion plays or mystery plays that reenacted the final days leading up to Jesus' death on the cross and then his resurrection. But notice, none of these is an attempt to supplant God or Jesus or Krishna or any of them. They don't, they're not signs of a lack of devotion, an attempt to supplant or subvert them. Just the opposite. They are precisely forms of worship and devotion. At one fan convention, DragonCon 2013, I met Jesus. Or rather, I met this guy. He is a guy who goes around conventions cosplaying as Jesus. And I took him to lunch. I had lunch with Jesus. Actually, his name is Anderson. But he's known popularly as Cosplay Jesus. And I asked him, why does he do this? And he says, Jesus is my superhero. And then he goes around to cons and he just kind of, people remark on his costume and they tell him stories of the way the church has abused them or the way they're just all sorts of things. And he just sits there and listens. And sometimes he apologizes and he tries to let them know that Jesus loves them. And he's trying to stand in Jesus' place. But please note, without supplanting Jesus. His is a deep respect and devotion. He's trying to sincerely imitate Jesus by loving people around him, but nobody in a million years would say, oh, you're trying to get rid of Jesus by cosplaying him. In other words, in many, I would argue perhaps most world religions, imitating a religious hero or a savior or God is exactly the point. Christians try to be like Jesus. Muslims try to be like Muhammad. Buddhists try to be like Buddha, and so forth. Fans imitating their fan object, as they do in cosplay, if you've ever been to a fan convention, only shows how much like religion fandom really is, because religions do that all the time. Imitation shows the similarity between fandom and religion from the religious side, not the opposite. Sandvoss's argument completely falls apart. On the other hand, Sandvoss's perspective has problems not only misunderstanding religion, but also misunderstanding Elvis impersonators and why they do what they do. If you ever talk to an Elvis impersonator, they are well aware that they can never supplant the king. The king is unique. The best they can do is approximate him, reflect him, to make him temporarily present. And they do this as an act of supreme respect, even devotion. Long time ago, I think it was like 1997, 96, somewhere around there, back when I was living in the United States, I went to a talk by an English literature professor from North Carolina State University who spent 6 months working as an Elvis impersonator. This was an idea of his publisher. They said, take your sabbatical and go be an Elvis impersonator. And he trained. And he wrote a book from it called I, Elvis, Confessions of a Counterfeit King. And he spent like that sequined costume he's wearing, those cost thousands of dollars if you get good ones. And and he showed us, how he broke down, how he studied tapes of Elvis, and he studied Elvis impersonators, and he broke down the moves that you do when you're lip syncing Elvis songs. And you can tell the ones who are really, really good at it, because they get close. But nobody has the kind of vitality and the command of the original, of the King. And the Elvis impersonators, he got to know some, they do it because they adore Elvis. It seems that Elvis impersonation is closer to religious devotion than Sandvoss would care to admit. Argument number 4, religions take their narratives as quote unquote literally true versus as fiction or myth, like fans do. So Jenkins argues that against calling fandom religious because religion implies belief, and belief implies what he calls literalization. That is, the religious person believes in the literal truth of the sacred text of his or her religion, unlike fans who only see their fan text as a sort of mythology which might illustrate principles that they believe, but they don't believe that anything historical happened, anything real happened. They understand that these texts are merely fiction. As long as someone understands the fictional nature of a text, according to Jenkins, it can't be religion. For such a person, quote, it's not about belief, but about ethics and about narrative that encapsulates shared values, close quote. All right. Let's take a look at that. There are a lot of presuppositions and prejudices at work underneath Jenkins' discourse. First is his belief that all religions take their sacred texts literally. Again, Eastern religions prove him wrong. There are many who do not take a literal view of their sacred texts, such as the Hindu Vedas or the Mahayana Buddhist Lotus Sutra, which is on the right, because it's Chinese, right? Sanskrit on the left, Chinese on the right. Jenkins seems to think that only the monotheistic religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are truly religions. And if he really believes that, I mean, maybe he just wasn't thinking, but if he really believes that, I'm sure the rest of the world is going to be surprised. Furthermore, not even in Christianity are all the stories believed to be literally true. No one thinks that there was a historical Good Samaritan who helped a Jew who had been attacked. That's the story that Jesus tells, but it expresses and shapes Christian values nonetheless. Many biblical scholars read the Christian book of Revelation as a book of symbols because it's apocalyptic literature. It's got dragons and beasts, and these different multi-headed beasts and the dragons and all that give us a frame for understanding history and the suffering and persecution that Christians were going through and still do go through in many parts of the world. Second, Jenkins seems to link religious belief in what a text says actually happened, like the resurrection of Jesus, and to be fair, Christianity is very interested in what actually happened historically. If Jesus was not raised from the dead, Paul says, if it's just a symbolical raising or a spiritual raising and not a physical flesh and blood historical raising, according to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, then everybody just go home. It's not worth it. Now, Jenkins links that belief in an actually raised, in these miraculous things actually happening, with irrationality, gullibility, naivete, and superstition. Two things to say in response to that. Number one, many Christians believe not because they're irrational, but not despite the evidence, but because of the evidence. For instance, that Jesus rose from the dead. There's really good historical evidence that he actually historically rose from the dead. And number two, Jenkins' remarks in Fans, Bloggers, and Gamers reminds me a great deal of Jolie Jensen's article on fandom as pathology, except he's pathologizing religion instead of fandom. The exact same response towards fans that Jensen criticizes, thinking them to be irrational and dangerous and all that, Jenkins displays towards religious believers, despite his assertion that he really respects religious belief on the bottom of page 17. But then see page 21, end of the first paragraph, where he links religiosity and religion with, quote, intense emotional experiences of texts. And when our sense-making framings break down, that we fall on other things that we do blindly, or that are about loss of control, or a respect for a higher authority, or compulsion, or so forth. All of these are non-rational things that he's linking with religion. So religion for him is ultimately about blind trust in a higher authority. It is antithetical to rational thinking. It's antithetical to making sense. In other words, it sounds very much as if he has bought into the mythology of the Enlightenment, where autonomous reason saves the day from the superstitious irrationality of ignorant people like fans and religious believers. And he believes that Enlightenment mythology very literally. When you read closely, it is unlikely that his hesitation to allow fandom to be called religious has anything to do with reasoning, but rather with a visceral emotional response against his own religious upbringing. And that response, that allergy to religion, that was reinforced at the university, because there are plenty of prejudices about religion being irrational at the university. He used to teach at MIT, for crying out loud, and now he teaches at USC. He wants to stay as far away as possible from his own Southern Baptist upbringing, so as to reinforce his self-construction, or what Sarah Thornton in her book Club Cultures, Music, Media, and Subcultural Capital calls an imagined subjectivity. He wants to imagine his subjectivity as rational, critical, and therefore unreligious, irreligious. He doesn't understand religion, and his aversion or his allergy to the word religion, or even to the word religiosity, like religion-like, sounds more like a gut reaction than a carefully thought out argument. And notice how he says in Fans and Bloggers and Gamers, it feels different. It feels to me different from religion. Ironically, in trying to spare fandom from pathologization, he ends up pathologizing religion. Fifth argument. Fandom doesn't require belief in a supernatural and or transcendent reality. So, Sandvoss claims on page 63, he claims that in contrast to religion, fandom lacks an absolute otherworldly framework through which social realities are constructed and legitimized. And he's obviously inspired by sociologist Peter Berger's work, Sacred Canopy from 1968. Likewise, Jenkins asserts that for fandom, there is still not the notion of a hierarchy of the divine or numinous that's part of religious practice. Actually, that's not exactly true. There are, I stumbled across an essay in which the scholar talked about fiction-based religions, like people who actually believe that the Valar in Lord of the Rings, or in the Valar in Lord of the Rings, like Gandalf and so forth, are actually real spiritual beings. And reality shifting, this kind of directed dreaming into Hogwarts or other fictional context, and the people who come back swear it's real, they swear they've been to an alternate universe. That kind of throws a wrench into this somewhat. However, there are other problems with this argument. Both assume a very narrow and honestly outdated definition of religion. That is, religion must be a belief in the supernatural or the divine or in God or gods and so forth. The problem with distancing fandom from religion because of this is twofold. First of all, there are many recognized religions that don't believe in a supernatural, or at least do not require belief in a supernatural. Theravada Buddhism on the left, Zen Buddhists in the middle, Confucianism on the right. Some try to, because of this, some try to relabel these as philosophies rather than religion, but it is impossible to build an airtight boundary between religion and life philosophy. Life philosophies have deep roots in a faith or vision of how the world ultimately is and how the world should be. And because of that, they simply are religious. Religion is a far wider category than just belief in a supernatural being. It requires a more flexible definition. If you are concerned about including all of the recognized world religions, you need to broaden your definition. That's just how it is. Further, fandom often does broach what could be called the numinous or the supernatural or the ultimate reality in one way or another. As British author and fan fiction writer Roz Kavanagh pointed out in an article in The Guardian, that UK newspaper, there is something in common between fanishness and religious feeling, and that thing is perhaps best thought of as an interest in spirituality, or at least a sense of transcendence. Many, though far from all, of the bits of popular culture which have inspired obsessive interest are concerned with what the religious would call last things. It is, after all, Buffy the Slayer who preserves humanity from vampires and other demons, who remarks that she has had to learn the plural of apocalypse. And you could say the same for Harry Potter for Gen Z, at least before Rowling got canceled. But I think there still are quite a few Potter fans who were interested in it because of the way it dealt with transcendence and ultimate issues of meaning and what human beings are here for. Let me continue. There is a distinctly utopian strain in Star Trek, whose deviser, Gene Roddenberry, appears genuinely to have believed that it was possible for technology and progress to make the world not only shinier and cleaner, but also kinder. However compromised by his white male privilege, the intentions demonstrated by his portrayal of a multi-ethnic, sexually integrated crew were a beacon in their day and a good thing, capital G, capital T. So, close quote. Not only is religion not always interested in the numinous and otherworldly, but fandom isn't always disinterested in the numinous and otherworldly as well. It's about ultimate reality. Sixth argument. Religion is simply one of many ways to share values or construct identity, so why single it out as parallel to fandom? Sandvoss, on page 62, points out that there are other social structures that people find emotionally significant that shape their identities beside religions, such as nation or ethnicity. Jenkins likewise states, people use religion as a metaphor to refer to the social practices of fandom. This is a community that people belong to and which articulates shared values and beliefs. In that sense, I don't see why the metaphor should be a religion any more than it could be a union or a political party or a social club or a fraternity, any number of which serve the same social function of being a community that articulates values and shared affect. None of these is adequate to what fandom is, but fandom is simply one form of social affiliation alongside others. Close quote. He acknowledges that there are areas of overlap, but he is quick to say that there are more differences between fandom and religion than there are similarities, and given his narrow, very narrow definition of religion, of course there are. But we've talked about that already. So what makes religion a more apt metaphor than these other social organizations like unions and nations and political parties and frat houses and so forth? What Jenkins and Sandvoss don't seem to understand is that any of the alternative social networks that they mention, nation, ethnicity, party, can likewise be considered types of religion depending on how they are used, how their meanings are articulated, and what they mean to their adherents. This has long been recognized by sociologists, that secular social groupings can take on a religious intensity and meaning. Marxism did that for many. Ethno-nationalism did it for many others. Political parties can be imbued with a sort of salvation significance. I mean, for crying out loud, MAGA, well, a lot of people say MAGA's a cult. Well, yeah, it is. I even heard one woman interviewed left the Christian church, and went to Trump rallies because she said, and this is almost a verbatim quote, "I like my saviors to be flesh and blood and here." Like, she saw Trump as a messianic figure. It's not simply a political movement when people start saying stuff like that. Matt Hills gets very close to this idea of applied to fandom when he talks about religiosity on page 20. He says, there is some kind of impulse that might be about a kind of individualized search for meaning. I'm suggesting that there is a culturally contextualized individual search for some kind of authenticity, connection, or meaning beyond the purely semiotic. That is beyond, what does he mean by semiotic? Beyond simply the way it's articulated for entertainment purposes within the texts themselves, but they gesture beyond that to something deeper. Any social structure can be and has been considered religious when it becomes the site for what we could call ultimate investment, an ultimate horizon of existence, something that is ultimately sacred to the person who's articulating it. And as such, it can be used as a means to search for meaning, guidance, emotional fulfillment, that which makes life worth living. That kind of investment makes the thing into which a person invests a kind of sacred space, a place that is of ultimate importance to that person who invests in it, a place which is mine and I will defend it. It is non-negotiable, which is why some fandoms get very fiercely toxic. It's about defending this sacred space. The Communist Party certainly has been that to some people here in the Czech Republic in the past. Resisting the communists for democratic ideals has been that for others in this country's history. In other words, when Hills and Jenkins begin talking about investment and meaning, and Sandvoss begins talking about Heimat, the German word for homeland. It's not a place. And the German, this is the German on the right, the German text on the right. Homeland is not a place. Homeland is a feeling, a Gefühl. When they start talking in those terms about finding your homeland, finding that place where you are ultimately at home, they're talking about the very stuff of religion. Fandom definitely has that kind of intensity for some, even to the point of making some fans defensively territorial, toxic. All right, the last argument against has to do with playfulness versus seriousness. Finally, Jenkins notes on page 21 that religion is often accompanied by a seriousness that only a tiny minority of fans actually exhibit. Religion is serious, fandom rarely so. Fandom is more typically characterized by a playful, tongue-in-cheek attitude that does not take itself too seriously, at least before fandom becomes politicized, and then it becomes very rough and tumble and toxic and stuff. But he's saying it's mostly playful, and therefore fandom cannot be considered on the model of religion, which is serious. I think this line of serious versus playful this boundary is much fuzzier than Jenkins realizes, both in the context of recognized religions and in the context of fandom. There are religions that can be described as playful, such as Taoism and Zen in particular are often playful types of religion in which, you obviously expend a lot of effort, but the point is not to take yourself too seriously. Judaism, likewise, has a rich vein of rabbinic humor alongside of rabbinic wisdom. This picture is taken from a joke that is found in the Talmud about a leader of a gang of thieves who sees Rabbi Yochanan bathing and jumps in after him to rob him. And the rabbi yells, "Your strength should be for Torah. Your beauty should be for women. If you repent, I'll give you my sister, who's more beautiful than I." And the guy decides on the spot to become a student of the rabbi. But please notice, he's making like a gay joke. He's like, "Hey, bro, no homo." Basically, you can have my sister, but I don't swing that way. That's kind of funny. I mean, it maybe doesn't translate so well into the 21st century, but it's kind of funny. And the Christian understanding of grace has a certain playful aspect to it. Because we are sinners, we cannot impress God with our moral strivings. The result is that Christians, and you have to believe me, I'm telling you the truth. Christians ought not to take themselves too seriously because God is a God of mercy and we need mercy. And so the renowned Christian theologian, which if you look at the time picture of him, looks like he was a barrel full of laughs, but he says grace creates liberated laughter. The grace of God is beautiful and it radiates joy and awakens humor. And that's from his church dogmatics, like this multi-volume, ginormous compendium of theology. Likewise, Christian philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, wrote of humor as being the boundary between the ethical and religious stages of life's journey. He wrote a book called Stages on Life's Way, and basically he said, if you're at all a serious sort of person, you start off in the aesthetic, in which you're trying to taste and experience everything. It's sort of sensual, hedonistic, but eventually there's a boundary between that. And that boundary is boredom and irony. Like everything becomes distant. It loses its immediacy. It loses its charm. And if you're at all a serious person, you will then pass into what he calls the ethical. And the ethical is where you try to do the right thing. You try to be a stand-up person. And he talks about, this figure of his Judge Wilhelm, who's like happily married, and he is a pillar of the community and stuff like that. But this too, if you're at all serious about getting to the real meaning of life, has a boundary. And that boundary is humor. That is to say, if you're serious about your ethical strivings, eventually you get to a point where you just have to look at yourself and shake your head and laugh because of these. You're not all that, right? You have to look at your own moral strivings and just the way God would look at them and just say, ain't you silly? You're trying so hard. And that becomes the boundary way. Not taking yourself seriously becomes the boundary way into what he calls religion A. And then from there into religion B, which is the religion of the Knight of Faith. If you know Kierkegaard's, what's the book's title? Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling. That's it. Anyway, the point being, the line between serious and playful in religion is often not so clear. They each involve the other. On the flip side, fans sometimes use very playful language to describe something they take very seriously, but might be embarrassed to admit that they're taking it very seriously. Like the reading that we skipped over, Rebecca Williams' piece on spoilers in Buffy the Vampire fandom written in the 90s. The people who long for spoilers call themselves spoiler whores, which is a kind of glib. But the reason that they're spoiler whores is because they care so deeply about the characters in the show. They likewise they self-label themselves as addicted or out of control or whatever. It's a way. This playful banter is a way of trying to say uncomfortable truths through ironic self-deprecation, so that you're not revealing too much of how very seriously you take this. In some other fan discourses, fans show themselves to be very serious. when they debate about the details of their fandom, when they start theory crafting, when they start arguing over who should ship with whom, that is, who should be in a fan fictional relationship with whom. Uh, will their show be renewed? Speculation about spoilers. What constitutes good fan fiction, and so forth and so forth. Fandom in these arguments is anything but trivial. It is, for most fans, really serious stuff. You could call it a sacred space. If you want a litmus test about how serious it's taken, see what happens to fandom when their show is threatened to be taken away, when their series is going to be canceled. I had a student some years ago who was super into the video game The Last of Us, the zombie shooter RPG game. The ending of the game packed an emotional punch. I'm not going to spoil it for those of you who don't know the TV show or the game, but by the end of it, this student of mine told me she found herself in absolute tears. But not just because the ending was so devastating. She told me that, and I'm quoting her almost verbatim, when the game ended, I felt that I had lost a friend. Like, she didn't want the game to be over. She had gotten so close to Elle, to Elle, that she'd traveled so far with her that she felt she just had a hard time letting go. And that's definitely taking your fandom seriously. It even felt to this student of mine, Cassandra, my student, it felt sacred. So yeah, I'd say fandom is playful, and fans can be playful when using religious metaphors, but that doesn't stop them from being deadly serious about what is sacred to them. That is their fan object. Now, however, I have changed my thinking a little bit about this for a very odd reason. I'm inclined to agree a bit with Jenkins here about tongue-in-cheek versus taking it seriously, because it just does feel to me that there is a qualitative difference between fandom and religious devotion. At least for me there is. I do not wear Christian t-shirts. I've been gifted one by a relative, and it was a kind gift. I use it as a sleep shirt, but I will not buy one, though I have been sorely tempted by this one. It pictures Jesus as a Jedi Knight with a cross-shaped lightsaber, and I thought that's very clever. But in the end, I passed on it for, number one, it seems a little glib, a little trivializing of Jesus, and two, I'm really don't like the idea of using the cross as a weapon. It's supposed to be a symbol of peace, nonviolence, reconciliation between God and man. You don't want to be killing people with it. And third, all the t-shirts that use this sort of image make Jesus really, really white, and he wasn't. That kind of bothers me. But also, in general, I don't do Christian t-shirts because I think Christian shirts are a dumb way of trying to start a conversation. Trying to start a conversation about spiritual matters. Such conversations flow better out of a genuine friendship, a genuine relationship where you can talk about stuff, and not because somebody asked questions about my t-shirt. And second, or B, I believe that the Lord I serve and my faith would somehow be reduced if I put something like that on a t-shirt. Like Christianity is too nuanced, too deep, and too precious to me for me to shrink it down into an ironic or humorous slogan or image. Even this one, even the Jedi Jesus one. By contrast, I have no problem doing that with Godzilla. I'm a huge Godzilla fan, and I actually own this shirt, except my shirt, the transfer was done way better. It lines up better with the shirt than this, but this was the only picture I could find of it. And it's one of my most precious t-shirts. I only wear it on special occasions. So you guys in my Understanding Media Fandom class, you should feel honored that I wore that shirt. Anyway, I have absolute, and I have many Godzilla t-shirts. I have absolutely no problem displaying my enthusiasm for the giant Tokyo stomping kaiju on my chest. Why? Because I risk nothing doing so, except maybe somebody thinking I'm immature, which, okay, whatever, I don't care. I love Godzilla. I'm not going to apologize for that. If I did the same to Jesus, I risk cheapening him. I risk non-Christians misunderstanding him, which might actually do them harm spiritually. I risk delegitimizing the faith in their eyes by equating it with a quite possibly cheesy image on my clothing. I do not judge those who wear such t-shirts, at least not out loud. But for me, no thank you. That's risking too much. I am not a Jesus fan. I'm a Christian who puts or tries to put Jesus at the center of everything I do and everything I am, not out of duty, but out of gratitude for what God has done for me through Jesus. I try to stay in step with the Spirit in a way that I do not try to keep in step with Godzilla, who is more than likely stomping Tokyo. But for those who base their loyalties elsewhere, it might be different. So basically, I want to say to Jenkins and Sandvoss, it's the line between serious and playful is very, very slippery and does not apply equally to all religions. But for at least my Christian religion, I kind of get what they're talking about. I get it. I might not agree completely. And I think that some fans might actually take it seriously enough, with intensity enough, that they would wear the t-shirt, but it's also kind of religious. I would not call myself a religious devotee of Godzilla. He's awesome, but not that awesome. All right, so what do these arguments get right? What Sandvoss and Jenkins get right is that fandom doesn't act like a typical institutionalized Western religion like Judaism or Christianity or Islam. They don't look like religions of the book that have mosques or temples or churches. Fandom, for one thing, tends to be much less institutionalized, although you might be interested to know that there is such a thing as the Church of the Jedi and the Church of Dudism, after the Coen brothers, Big Lebowski character, the Dude. Fandoms are not typically as exclusivist or universalistic or tradition-bound or literalistic or concerned with the supernatural as these religions of the book. They are very different from the traditional religions that we know in the West. But the face of religion has been changing as the West becomes more and more individualistic. And fandom, I believe, is a big part of that. So perhaps we need a broader definition of religion. Jenkins seems to believe that all religion is pretty similar to what he experienced growing up as a Southern Baptist. Strict, absolutist belief in the supernatural, which to his mind is uncritical, unthinking, blind obedience to authority, blah, 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 blah. And whatever fandom is, it can't be that. Likewise, Sandvoss links religion to the transcendent and the otherworldly, ignoring other broader functional definitions of religion, and so ways that fandom functions as religion are ignored in the way it provides community or creativity or meaning or moral perspective. But fandom isn't just a club. It is at least a club, but it means so much more to many of those who participate in it. Maybe, just maybe, we need a more flexible, holistic understanding of what religion means in human existence. So, here is my definition that I use in my class, Comparative Religions, when we start off trying to define religion. Religion is that dimension of all of life that deals with our existence as a whole in its coherence and its brokenness. It deals with what is finally real, if anything is, and our response to the real. Religion, as a dimension of all of life, is not just an intellectual endeavor, but a life response that engages the whole person, intellect, emotions, will, and action at the level of deepest need, and places him or her in the context of shared symbols, stories, structures, and meanings by which he or she can interpret what is going on in the world, his or her community, and his or herself, and act upon these. So religion, I'm arguing in this definition, is the depth dimension of human existence, and anything, and I mean anything, can be invested with that kind of religious intensity, with that kind of religious significance. So let's take a look at some of the arguments for fandom as a religion. Fan scholar Michael Yindra, who wrote a very well-regarded essay in the 1990s, argues from the comprehensiveness of the moral and metaphysical vision of Star Trek that its fans take away from the show, inspired by its creator, Gene Roddenberry, that the fans are participating in what he calls a folk religion, or a folk philosophy. Of course, this means that religion cannot simply mean belief in God or gods, because Star Trek's philosophy is sort of an optimistic, atheistic humanism that preaches, and that's not too strong a word, preaches that our technological prowess and science and tolerance, IDIC, which is the little arrow thing that they wear is the IDIC symbol. It means infinite diversity in infinite combinations, which just means tolerate lots of difference. DEI. Star Trek preaches that our technological prowess and science and tolerance will solve humanity's problems. It'll give us sort of a secular salvation. We don't need God. We are quite capable of saving ourselves. Different fans draw upon this philosophy differently, but it is striking the depth of investment many people put into it. They see it as a vision of life that should or must be followed. Not so much nowadays, although there still are hardcore Star Trek fans around, but I think Star Trek has lost a lot of its cultural resonance and relevance. But back in the 1990s, Star Trek was a fan favorite. So Yindra quotes one of the fans he interviewed. "I watched the show and try to live my life by Roddenberry's example of hard work, imagination, compassion, curiosity, courage, and keeping an eye on the future while working to make the present better one day at a time. I don't always succeed, and we all do fall prey to our faults, but I keep trying. I'll close by saying that the dream is what is important, and it should be protected above all and not turned into a soap opera or the next Scientology." And I guess that was an online survey because I don't think people say when you're interviewing them, all close by. So Yindra notes that many ways fans combine it with their existing religious commitments, or some use it to replace their old religious upbringing. This is what Sandvoss calls convergence, where fan outlook on life and fan object converge. This is super convergent. The overall picture he gives us is of a discourse, a cultural discourse that has a depth of meaning that makes it suitable for all kinds of investment, which I've been calling religious. Let's take another example. Cultural scholar Julie Ingersoll made a similar point when she wrote about the moral vision that binds together the parrot head community. It's a commitment to life without too many material possessions, where Margaritaville is a virtual sacred space which parrot heads try to bring to life at concerts, and especially the before concert parties. They can't do that anymore because Jimmy Buffett, by the way, if you don't know, parrot head, like these guys, are literally trying to be parrot heads. Parrot heads are the term for Jimmy Buffett fans. Jimmy Buffett being the American pop singer, songwriter from the 1970s through the 1990s and even into the 2020s. No, 2010s. They can't do the pre-concert thing anymore because Jimmy Buffett died on September 1st, 2023. Now, what I found interesting in Ingersoll's account, and for you students, you Anglo-American students, you can find her essay on Neo. What I found interesting in her account was her use of anthropologist Victor Turner's concept of communitas. That is the way that religions create a ritual space of egalitarian community where we're all one, that is separated off from everyday life through rituals that kind of serve as boundary markers, and that is the lifeblood of religious communities. And you can hear shades of Victor Turner in Jenkins and Camille Bacon-Smith's positive assessment of fan communities. Ingersoll uses this concept to explain why Jimmy Buffett fans can be simultaneously enthusiastic about the Buffett view of life, in which you're a beach bum and you're not burdened by many possessions, you're just mobile, you just hang out on the beach, and you're poor and you bum a cigarette and stuff like that, and simultaneously absorbed into a consumer lifestyle in the everyday world. And this is true of Jimmy Buffett himself. Jimmy Buffett had this kind of beach bum persona, where this beach tramp who didn't have a lot, but he got by and he just kind of played around and got lost in Margaritaville. In reality, Jimmy Buffett owned a private jet, a yacht, and so forth, very different from the beach tramp. And her answer was, because Jimmy Buffett fandom isn't about the everyday world, it is about this alternate sacred space which people travel to experience, a feeling of, and here I'm quoting her, quote, being connected to something bigger than themselves that gives meaning, close quote. So using this ritually marked off space as a marker for religion, Ingersoll can reconcile the apparent irreligion of Buffett fans with their manifestly ritual activity in these pre-concert shows. And I believe that there are other sets of fan rituals that could be fruitfully read from a similar perspective. Now, if you want to know what I'm talking about, there's like a 1.5 minute clip called Parrot Heads Return to Jones Beach being on Long Island. And they interview them about what's going on in Long Island. I think they said 80,000 people. 80,000 people show up for this pre-concert show, for which there is only room for 15,000. So it's not even about the concert, it's about the party before the concert. Anyway, I'm going to pause for like 5 seconds to let you pause the video and go watch it if you want to. If you don't want to, no skin off my nose. Okay, welcome back. So finally, Ingersoll applies her findings to the secularization debate. This saying that perhaps fandom is an up-and-coming form of religion that's displacing traditional forms of religion. So if you don't know, if you're not into sociology of religion, the secularization thesis, which most, if not all, sociologists subscribed to from the 1950s up till the 1980s, when we had, a lot of really strident public religions breaking through, like the Ayatollah Khomeini and Muslim extremism and the religious right in America and all that. The secularization thesis said that the increasing social pluralism of the world and the increasing technological sophistication and increasing diversification of economies would inevitably cause religion to disappear slowly but surely from the developed world. Well, part of it's true. It is true that at least in the global north and west, traditional religious institutions have lost a lot of their social clout in many places, and many people have in turn lost faith in institutional religions. People have in many places in the West during the last 200 years, people have not therefore gotten less religious. Rather, religion has become more flexible, more diverse, displaced into other forms. Alongside institutional religion, there are also individualized forms of religion, as well as what Ingersoll calls individualized forms like Sheilaism, for example, as well as what Ingersoll calls a, quote, third form of religion, or what cultural scholar and fiction writer Tara Isabella Burton calls the religious remixed. But this is what Ingersoll says about it. Often scholars have focused on religion and asked if there was something about the religious experience that drew people to it. The question has made religion seem to be a thing out there that automatically attracted adherents. I would propose that an examination of the religiosity of a particular group of music fans, such as this one, Jimmy Buffett's Parrot Heads, shows us that this traditional framing of the question misses the mark. What we have, it seems, is not necessarily something essentially religious that draws people in, but something essentially human that makes them seek it, that is, makes them seek the religious, whatever its form. Essential human needs for meaning, purpose, ritual, community, and transcendent experience, in which I include any experience that satisfies our need to feel a part of something bigger than ourselves, whether it is an Eastern mystical oneness within the universe or Christian communion, have been met in different ways in different societies. Most recently in the West, those needs have been met by institutional religion. For this reason, institutional religion has functioned as our benchmark. However, these needs are so essentially human that human beings will always find ways to fulfill them. Parrot heads who live in a secular world in which institutional religion has lost its cultural clout and is imbued with skeptical cynicism about institutions generally will create a sense of community where they find the necessary tools to do so. In other words, guys, in modern society, people still yearn for meaning and community and for some sense of sacredness. And often, they don't wait for religion to come to them. They will make it for themselves whenever they find something that resonates deeply with their desires and their perspective. If they feel they cannot trust institutional religious authority anymore, they'll make their own religion somewhere else. So, the verdict about this debate, at least from my perspective, the arguments against seeing fandom as a type of functional religion depend on an overly narrow definition of religion, one that doesn't even describe known world religions. And they seem to me pretty weak arguments, honestly. In my opinion, the writers who shy away from describing fandom in religious terms don't always do so for intellectual reasons. It seems clear to me, at least in the case of Jenkins, that there is an emotional backlash or an allergy against religion involving his own religious upbringing. But additionally, many scholars have a desire to want to be perceived as professional and rational in their handling of fandom, their way of dealing with the social pressures of university culture, which often has an anti-religious bias. And religion has for them a taint of irrationality, so that they must distance them from religion, at least if they want to make tenure and want to keep their jobs. And that is what Jolie Jensen was talking about in her Enlightenment myth, that reason alone can give us truth and so forth. This anti-religious perspective, where religion is seen as irrational and tainted, dominates much of academia. What I find so ironic is for scholars like Jenkins, who chafe at the idea of fans being stigmatized by seeing them as irrational and pathological, they have no problem stigmatizing religion in a similar way. They see religion as irrational, tainted, dangerous, whatever. It may just be that they themselves are religiously invested against the category of religion. That is, their meaning and self-image are tied up in distancing themselves from religion, which might stain their reputations. So, that's what I got to say. If you want to explore this idea further, I highly recommend Tara Isabel Burton, this cultural scholar and fiction writer, her book, Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. And if you're interested, I'm working on a book in which I did an empirical study of a bunch of fans, did some surveys and interviews, and am trying to put together to what extent can fandom be seen as religious. So I hope to have a first draft of that done by the end of January 2026. I've done it now. I'm on record as saying that on YouTube. But anyway, and then I don't know how long it's going to take out. Generally, editing and finding a publisher and stuff takes at least a year. So do be patient, but for you praying types out there, pray that the book gets done. Anyway, that's what I got to say about this. And I am looking forward to you students having some questions about it, having some pushback or some of your own thoughts while I present on my own research for you. in class. Okay, and for those of you who aren't in my class, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something, and I enjoyed putting it together for you. Take care and stay safe out there. See you next time.